In the early days of February 1959, 9 hikers would begin a journey up a mountain ominously named Dead Mountain. None of them would make it out alive. In the days following, all 9 hikers would be found with some of the most horrific injuries imaginable. And even worse, hardly a single clue as to what happened to them on the mountain. Theories range from everything from an avalanche to the Yeti. The case remains cold to this very day and has since become known as the Dyatlov Pass incident. When it comes to famous, mysterious, or terrifying disappearances, there are very, very few that are famous as Dyatlov Pass. There are movies, there are books, endless YouTube videos. A lot of people know about it, and I wouldn't be too surprised if you've heard about it. What a lot of people don't know is that 1,800 miles to the southeast, something very similar, but in my opinion, far more terrifying unfolded. Let's fast forward about 34 years. August 2nd, 1993. Ludmila Korovina was taking 6 of her students on a hike across the Khamar Daban mountain range. This was to further help her 6 students who, I should probably mention, were very, very young. The youngest of the group was only 15 at the time. The main purpose for the trip was to reinforce the survival skills that Korovina was teaching her students at the time. The plan was simple. Her and her 6 students would make their way from the small village of Marino, which was right on the edge of Lake Baikal, up the mountain pass. A few days on the trip, they were planning to rendezvous with another group. One of the hikers in the other group was Korovina's daughter, Natalia. And so finally, they would complete the hike in another small village called Zlodyanka. All in all, if I had to make a guesstimate, it would probably take a week and a half tops. For most of them, the trip only lasted 3 days. The aforementioned rendezvous was supposed to take place on August 5th. However, come August 5th, they don't show up. Now, Korovina's daughter, Natalia, she really didn't worry that much because the night before, the area had been hit by a very bad rainstorm. She figured they just got caught up in the rain, and she knew that her mother was very skilled, so she figured she'd be fine. She, in all honesty, knowing what she knew, she really didn't have to worry that much. However, no trace of the group would be found until August 10th. On the morning of August 10th, a group of kayakers were making their way across the Dyatlov River, approximately 70 miles from Lake Baikal. While kayaking, they noticed a figure. That figure turned out to be one of the members of Korovina's group, Valentina Ludachenko. When the group spotted Valentina, she was, let's say, in not great shape. Some accounts state that upon approaching her, it looked as if she was covered in dry blood, although that was never confirmed and it's just a rumor. When they asked Valentina about what happened, she burst into tears. After a few hours, Valentina was finally able to give the group her name and the fact that she was traveling with 6 other people who were no longer alive. The kayakers, obviously terrified by this, immediately took her over to a police station where they both filed reports. Now, while at the police station, she did not talk about the incident for a few more days, but eventually she gave an account of what happened up on the mountain. This would be the only time she would go on record about what happened in the Khamar Daban Pass. To this day, she refuses to say another word of it, which I don't blame her because her story is absolutely terrifying. I want to give a quick disclaimer. The story that I'm about to tell is straight from Valentina herself. It is one of the most terrifying stories I've ever heard. You have been warned. The group arrived at a hiking spot on August 2nd, 1993. During the first 2 days of the hike, all was well. In fact, it was going better than previously thought because of the very favoring weather conditions outside. This would change on August 4th when, like I said earlier, a very powerful rainstorm unexpectedly hit the area. However, the group would continue trekking through the weather and even managed to take a picture or two, including this one, which to my knowledge is one of, or very possibly, the last photo taken of the group while those 6 hikers were still alive. On the evening of August 4th, the group set camp right as the storm was still raging, and this is actually where the very first mystery arises. See, they set up camp right out in the open, even though just a few hundred meters away there was adequate enough tree line to give them shelter. There are many theories floating around, but the main one is that they were simply too tired to take another step, and that's the one that I personally believe. Any way you look at it, on the evening of August 4th, the group made camp and went to sleep for the final time. The morning of August 5th, 1993 was, for the 7 hikers, at first, ordinary. They got up and the storm was gone. They had their breakfast and they laid out their plan. It was simple: eat breakfast, get to the rendezvous point. With the conditions now a lot more favorable and with the very skilled members they had, they would probably be able to reach it by the end of the day. So they packed up the stuff and got moving, business as usual. However, a few minutes into it, from the very back of the group, they heard a scream. It was Sacha Kirsten, 23 years old. By the time the group noticed he was in distress, he was already on the ground. He was foaming at the mouth and blood was seeping out of his eyes and ears. He fell to the ground and began convulsing. A few minutes later, he stopped. Almost immediately after, Korovina ran to Kirsten's aid, telling the others to go on ahead, and they did. But, moments later, they heard another scream. This time from Korovina. As they looked behind them, they saw Korovina showing the exact same symptoms that Kirsten saw. Moments later, she too would collapse. She was 41. Tatiana Filipinko, age 24, would be the first to reach Korovina after her collapse. After a few seconds spent trying to resuscitate her, she began to grab at her throat, struggling to breathe. Her death was probably the most disturbing out of the 6. To spare herself from the symptoms that were soon to come, she began bashing her head on a nearby rock until she stopped moving. By this point, the 4 survivors were, understandably, quite terrified. Timur Papanov and Victoria Zalisova, aged 15 and 16, decided to make a run for it, while 19-year-old Denis Shavakin hid behind a rock. Papanov and Zalisova would be the next to go, collapsing at the same time while running. They then began to throw up blood and clawed their necks before going limp. Realizing they were the only survivors, Valentina and Dennis decided to run to each other and get out of the area as fast as possible. However, not long after the two attempted to make their escape, Dennis collapsed. His mouth would begin to foam, and blood would start pouring from his eyes and throat. And then, he stopped moving. With only a small tent and the clothes on her back, Valentina ran for her life for what must have felt like hours. Eventually, she made it to a point where she felt like she was far enough away. She made camp and went to sleep. The next morning, Valentina woke up, very much alive. However, Valentina knew that she did not have enough supplies to survive in the woods. So, she made a very risky decision. She returned to the original campsite. When she returned, all 6 other hikers were, without a shadow of a doubt, dead. Valentina worked fast and acquired the supplies she needed from the bodies of her friends. It seemed whatever killed the others was gone. It was a risky idea, but it ended up paying off. Through the next 4 days, she followed power lines present on the mountain, which then led her to the kayakers we discussed earlier. Valentina relayed the story to the police, but for an unknown reason, they did not conduct a search for 2 whole weeks. When the search was finally called in, the bodies were found exactly how Valentina described. Once the bodies were found, they were taken in for autopsies, and with the exception of Korovina, the cause of death for all the victims was hypothermia and protein deficiency. The cause of death for Korovina was heart attack. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never heard of hypothermia causing people to start going rabid out of nowhere. I don't think that's ever happened. Also, another thing, hypothermia does not just suddenly come on. It is an illness which comes in stages. It starts low, but obviously ends horribly. With how fast the symptoms came on with the hikers, there's just no way it could have been hypothermia. It just does not come that fast. But even with that, they decided to list the cause of death as hypothermia, except for Korovina with her heart attack. Which brings me to a point. Kids, always trust what the government has to say. Now, in all seriousness, approximately no one bought the hypothermia explanation. So, to this day, many people have come up with their own theories as to what actually happened on the mountain. But before we go into that, I want to give you an explanation about why some people thought it was hypothermia. As I mentioned earlier, one of the symptoms was tearing at their throats and tearing at their clothes. In severe hypothermia cases, at the very end of it, usually hours or even minutes before death, the person will, for some reason, begin to take off their clothes. Probably because the blood vessels are so tightly constricted that the body is just using the last bits of its thermal energy in one last hurrah and a last ditch effort to save warmth. It's a phenomenon known as paradoxal undressing. Now, like I said, the only reason I'm explaining this is I just want you to have a better picture as to why some people might think it's hypothermia. And also, so I can tell you why it's wrong and they're stupid. Something I've neglected to mention until now is that Korovina was a very skilled forager. If the group was running low on food, she could find organisms and wildlife and also vegetation that could keep the group fed. One of the organisms found in the Khamar Daban area was mushrooms. The theory goes that for breakfast that morning, the group found mushrooms and decided to prepare them. Now, a lot of mushrooms in the area contain the toxin known as psilocybin, which can cause a wide variety of symptoms: nausea, vomiting, dizziness, lack of coordination, and hallucinations. One of the most well-known hallucinations of a psilocybin trip is seeing people cry blood. So, hypothetically, the group could have ingested these toxic mushrooms during the breakfast and then experienced one of the craziest psilocybin trips you've ever heard of. And then, between the 2 weeks between Valentina's appearance and the eventual appearance of their bodies, they could have just succumbed to hypothermia. Now, there are a few issues with this theory. One, Valentina never mentioned anything about eating mushrooms. Actually, she never even mentioned anything about eating anything suspicious. She never even mentioned the group even going foraging for food. And this might be opinion, but I felt like with how skilled Korovina was at foraging and at knowing nature, I feel like she would have known if a mushroom was toxic or not. And even if she had doubts, I feel like she wouldn't have took the risk of feeding it to the entire group. One question a lot of people ask is, well, if Valentina ate the mushrooms, how did she survive? And I guess she could have just ate a lower dose. I mean, it would explain why she saw people cry blood, but maybe she had a tolerance, but none of that can be confirmed. It's reasons like that that I don't fully disbelieve this theory, but there's just too many reasonable doubts, for me at least. The next theory I want to mention is that maybe the group stumbled off the trail and saw something they shouldn't have. It's no secret that in the final days of the Cold War, Russia had to hide a lot of illegal experiments they were doing at the time lest they faced a lot of public outcry. Possibly, they could have hid this up on the mountain, and once the group saw it, they were killed. But why would Valentina be kept alive? If they hid something that they would be willing to kill people for even seeing it, why would they just say, okay, you sick, you're all dead, but you can live. You can live. And then why would they let her go public about the story? I mean, maybe they could have just made up the whole crying blood and forced her to say it like that, and maybe that's why she won't give any more of the story, but that's just way too far-fetched, even for this case. And also, this is very much a big one. The Khamar Daban region is very public. It's not super remote. It's not super private. It is a very public area in which hundreds of people go every year. Why in the world would the Russian government try to hide their illegal stuff there, of all places, where hundreds of people could discover it? Now, the last theory I want to mention is, to me, the scariest, but it might just be the most plausible. Like I mentioned earlier, it's no secret that Soviet Union, Russia, was doing some very, to put it lightly, shady stuff. One of these experiments was the creation of nerve gases for chemical warfare. Now, let me just be clear, the US was doing this too. This was not just a Soviet-Russia thing. But after the Cold War ended, they obviously couldn't have these types of weapons anymore, so they had to hide them. They possibly could have hid them up in the Soviet mountains. One of the most infamous gases created by the Soviet Union was a gas called Novichok. It is 8 times more deadly than VX, 20 times more toxic than sarin gas, which, if you're not aware, was the type of gas used in the 1995 Tokyo subway attacks, which caused 14 people to lose their lives. Now, let's back to the question. How did a gas as toxic as that even make it onto this mountain? I think I have a reason. Most nerve gases evaporate rather quickly. However, given the right storage conditions, Novichok gas can remain active and lethal for up to 50 years. And with the conditions up on the mountain, it could have lasted months. You could say that in the final days of Novichok production, the government decided to hide it in a remote area of the mountain. Now, theoretically, it'd be kept safe, it'd be kept away from the public, until it was washed down by, say, a severe rainstorm, which, guess what happened the night before? It would have been concentrated in very small, specific spots that would have been then treaded on by, say, Sacha Kirsan. When Korovina ran to his aid, she would too succumb to the gas, and so on, until they all dropped like flies. Also, I want to mention, the year they stopped producing this type of gas, 1993. Gee, I wonder why. Still raises one question. How did Valentina survive? I guess you could say that she was just lucky enough not to tread on the gas. Let me clarify, this is not me definitively saying this is what happened. There are still plenty of holes that you can poke in this theory. It's just for me, for now at least, this is the one that I tend to believe the most. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the story of the Khamar Daban Pass incident. To this day, no one has a definitive answer of what happened. It's all theories and speculation. People have tried to talk to Valentina about it, but she refuses to talk about it to this day, probably because of mental trauma, which, hey, I don't blame her. Please do not try to contact Valentina. It is clear that she just wants to be left alone. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. This was actually my very first time trying a video like this. I really hope it went well. There were plenty of technical buffs along the way that I had to kink out, but I hope it all worked out well. If you want to learn more about this, I included the link to every article I used down in the description. Also, gotta mention, 2 of my favorite channels on the entire platform, Wendigoon and Nick Crowley, made far better videos on the incident than I did. But either way, I still hope you enjoyed it. Take care of yourself. Peace out. Good night.